President Donald Trump is facing intensifying political heat after his explosive Sunday Truth Social post targeting Iran. Now, a post that was not just fiery, but also laced with expletives and direct threats of military action. Just a while ago, Donald Trump defended his post, saying fiery words were needed to make a larger point to Iran. The message that was posted on Easter Sunday warned Iran to reopen the Strait of Hormuz or face with foul and derogative language. In fact, he's even threatened strikes on Iran's critical infrastructure like power plants and bridges. After the post, several critics, including insiders as well as lawmakers, reportedly began calling for considering Section 4 of the 25th Amendment of the U.S. Constitution, with several commentators demanding his impeachment. Democratic Senate Minority Leader Chuck Schumer wished Americans on Easter as he lambasted Trump, saying that the President of the United States is, quote, ranting like an unhinged madman on social media. In fact, Schumer added that Trump was threatening possible war crimes.
All right, people. Welcome back to Dr. John Podcast. The dramatic headlines claiming the Senate has invoked Article 2, Section 4 to remove Trump are fiction. But the conversations about constitutional removal mechanisms are real, happening publicly among senators, scholars, and lawmakers. The underlying reasons why these discussions keep surfacing are genuinely more alarming than any single headline. So let's back up and start with what Article 2, Section 4 actually says, because I promise you, most people who have heard the phrase thrown around do not actually know what is written in that clause. The text of the Constitution reads, and I want you to hear these words exactly as they were written: the President, Vice President, and all civil officers of the United States shall be removed from office on impeachment for and conviction of treason, bribery, or other high crimes and misdemeanors. That is the entire clause. That is the whole thing.
And alienating allies, and that the country deserved so much better. Not just him, Democrat leader Bernie Sanders also echoed similar tones, pointing out Trump's remarks as ravings of a dangerous and mentally unbalanced individual. He also called upon Congress to act so the war could end. While Senator Tim Kaine of Virginia, also a Democrat, noted that it was not the first time that the 79-year-old Trump had used stark language. Kaine said that explicit threats to bomb Iran into Stone Age are embarrassing and juvenile, suggesting that there was a clear absence of plan and rationale within the Trump administration. So what is this provision? Let's tell you. And why is it suddenly at the center of a fiery political debate in Washington? Well, Section 4 of the 25th Amendment provides a constitutional mechanism to remove a president who is deemed unfit to discharge the duties of office. Now, it can be triggered by the Vice President.
And here is what that actually means in practice when you strip away all the dramatic interpretation and focus on the constitutional mechanics. The House of Representatives holds the exclusive power to bring charges against a president, which is what impeachment actually is in constitutional terms. It is not removal. It is the formal accusation stage. If a simple majority of the House votes to impeach, a majority meaning 218 votes or more, the case then moves to the Senate for a full trial. And this is where the threshold becomes genuinely steep, because conviction in a Senate impeachment trial requires a supermajority, 2/3 of the senators present and voting. In a full Senate, that means 67 votes.
And a majority of the cabinet who formally declare the president as incapable. And once that happens, the vice president immediately becomes the acting president. Now, the president can challenge this decision, but if that happens, the final call shifts to the Congress. The roots of this amendment go back to a moment of national trauma, the assassination of John F. Kennedy back in 1963. It exposed a critical gap in the American Constitution. What happens if a president is unable to serve but cannot declare it? In response, the Congress proposed this amendment in 1965. Section 4 was specifically designed for situations where a president is incapacitated but unwilling or unable to step aside. But this powerful provision, remember, comes with serious concerns. Critics warn that it could be politically misused, not just for incapacity, but to remove an unpopular leader as well. There is no clear definition of what inability actually means. leaving room for subjective interpretation.
Out of 100. Not 51, not a simple majority, not close to a simple majority, 67 votes. And when that two-thirds conviction happens, removal under Article 2, Section 4 becomes automatic and immediate. There is no appeal. There is no veto. There is no way for the president to contest it or delay it. Two-thirds conviction in the Senate, and the president is out of office before the gavel even comes down. That is how powerful this clause is when it actually gets invoked and when the votes are there to back it up. Now here is the critical distinction that separates the dramatic headlines from constitutional reality. The Senate by itself cannot invoke Article 2, Section 4. The Senate cannot unilaterally decide to remove a president.
The process itself raises questions. The vice president and the cabinets who stand to gain power are the ones who initiate it. And strikingly, there is no formal role for medical experts making this a deeply political and not purely medical decision. And this is why Section 4 remains the most debated and sensitive part of the 25th Amendment. The American Constitution does not clearly define incapacity. It can include serious physical or mental inability to govern. It may also extend to extreme situations like capture or disappearance during war. But ultimately, the term is left intentionally vague, allowing flexibility, but also opening the door to dispute. Now, calls to invoke Section 4 against President Trump may be growing, but the reality is that Section 4 is an extraordinary constitutional tool designed for extreme circumstances and not every political crisis.
The constitutional process is sequential, and it requires action from two separate institutions with different vote thresholds at each stage. One chamber charges, the other chamber tries, and you need two-thirds to convict. Without all of those pieces in place and succeeding at each step, Article 2, Section 4 removal simply does not happen regardless of how many senators talk about it in speeches or sign letters referencing it. The Constitution does not care how loudly senators invoke a clause. It cares whether the votes are there at each step of a very specific and intentionally difficult process. The framers designed this system to be hard to use. They wanted removal of a sitting president to require overwhelming consensus precisely because they did not want partisan majorities to be able to topple a president they simply disagreed with politically. But here is where the story gets genuinely serious and why this is not just a story about misleading YouTube thumbnails. Senators and lawmakers are publicly discussing Article 2, Section 4 and the 25th Amendment right now in a way that is genuinely unprecedented in recent American history. Think about this for a moment. When was the last time you heard serious politicians, not fringe voices, not partisan bomb throwers, but senators who sit on major committees and speak regularly on the floor of the Senate, invoking the constitutional removal mechanisms in connection with the sitting president's behavior? The answer is basically never. Not at this frequency, not in this sustained way, not with this level of directness. And the specific things that have prompted these discussions are important to understand because they are not abstract concerns or hypothetical fears. Senators have cited Trump's defiance of federal court orders, documented instances where the administration has ignored judicial mandates. They have cited his social media posts threatening to bomb civilian infrastructure in Iran. They have pointed to the administration's pattern of ignoring injunctions and judicial mandates as if they were optional suggestions rather than binding legal commands. And there is a general sense among some lawmakers from both parties that something has fundamentally shifted in how this presidency operates relative to the constitutional limits the system is supposed to enforce. When senators start regularly talking about the constitutional mechanisms for removing a president in the middle of his term, that tells you something about how those senators are assessing the situation they are watching. That assessment, that political and constitutional temperature reading, is what this story is really about. Not a removal that happened tonight, but a conversation that keeps coming back because the underlying concerns driving it have not gone away and show no signs of disappearing. So today, let me walk you through three things things that will give you a complete understanding of what is actually happening versus what the dramatic headlines are promising. First, we are going to explain clearly and fully how Article 2, Section 4 actually works so you understand the real constitutional mechanism and why the thumbnail version is misleading. Second, we are going to talk about the 25th Amendment, which is a completely separate removal mechanism that often gets discussed at the same time and is just as widely misunderstood by people who only know the phrase without understanding the process. And third, we are going to talk about why politicians and senators invoking these clauses publicly, even rhetorically, even without the votes to make anything happen right now, is itself a significant political story that tells you more about where this country stands than any single dramatic removal event ever could. The fact that these conversations are happening at all is the real headline. Not whether they succeeded tonight, but why they are happening so frequently and so publicly. Let's start with Article 2, Section 4 and the impeachment and conviction process, because I think the biggest misunderstanding people have about this clause is that they hear senators talk about it and they assume the Senate has some unilateral power to use it. They do not. The constitutional process is sequential and it requires action from two separate institutions with different vote thresholds at each stage. Let me walk you through exactly how it works step by step, because understanding the mechanics is the only way to separate reality from the dramatic fiction that circulates online. First, the House of Representatives must vote to impeach. Impeachment is essentially the bringing of formal charges against the president. It requires a simple majority of the House, which means 218 votes or more. If the House votes to impeach, the matter then moves to the Senate for a full trial. Second, the Senate conducts a full trial with the House members who brought the charges acting as prosecutors and the Senate members acting as jurors. This is not a quick process. This is a formal trial with evidence, with witnesses, with arguments from both sides. After the trial, a vote is taken on each article of impeachment. And here is the critical threshold that most people do not fully grasp. Conviction in a Senate impeachment trial requires 2/3 of the senators present and voting. That means in a full Senate, 67 votes out of 100, not a simple majority, not 51 votes, not even 60 votes, 67 votes. And only after that, 2/3 conviction vote, does the removal under Article 2, Section 4 become automatic and immediate. There is no third step, no second appeal, no way for the president to contest it. 2/3 conviction equals automatic removal, but without that 2/3 conviction, nothing happens. The president stays in office and the process ends. The bar is extraordinarily high for a reason. The framers did not want Congress to be able to easily remove presidents over political disagreements. They required a massive supermajority specifically to ensure that removal only happens in extreme circumstances with genuinely broad consensus across party lines. They wanted it to be hard. They wanted it to require more than just partisan opposition. Now let's put this in the context of Trump's actual history with this process, because he has been through it twice and neither time resulted in removal. The specific numbers from those trials are important for understanding why the current discussion, while genuine, faces the same fundamental math problem. The first impeachment in 2019 over Ukraine ended in Senate acquittal. The vote to convict was almost entirely along party lines. Only Mitt Romney broke with Republicans to vote guilty on one article. That was not even close to the 2/3 threshold. The second impeachment in January 2021 for incitement of insurrection after January 6th was a fundamentally different situation. That one was the closest any Senate impeachment trial of Trump has come to the 2/3 needed for removal. 57 senators voted to convict. That is right, 57. 7 Republicans crossed party lines to vote against their own party's president. 7 members of Trump's own party stood up in the Senate and voted guilty. That is the most bipartisan vote to convict in an impeachment trial in American history, and it still fell 10 votes short. 57 is not 67, and in the current Senate, Republicans hold the majority. Getting 10 or more Republican senators to vote to convict Trump would be required to reach 2/3 from the current starting point. And in the political environment of Trump's second term, where the Republican Party has been consolidated around loyalty to Trump in ways that are even more intense than during his first term, getting that many Republicans to cross over is not a realistic near-term expectation. Which is precisely why the public conversations about Article 2, Section 4 stay at the level of rhetoric and political pressure, rather than advancing into a formal constitutional process with a realistic path to the required supermajority. The senators talking about these clauses know the math. They are not naive about what removal currently requires. They understand that the votes are not there. But they are making a very deliberate choice to put these conversations in the public record anyway. And understanding why they are making that choice is as important as understanding the constitutional mechanics themselves. You do not repeatedly reference the most extreme constitutional removal mechanisms in your public statements unless you believe the situation warrants people paying close attention to what those mechanisms say and when they apply. These senators are not just talking to hear themselves speak. They are establishing a record. They are drawing lines. They are saying this is the standard, and this president's conduct is approaching it or crossing it. Now let's talk about the 25th Amendment, because this is a completely separate removal mechanism from impeachment, and it gets discussed in parallel and often gets confused with Article 2, Section 4, even though they are designed for very different situations. The 25th Amendment was ratified in 1967, primarily in response to concerns about presidential succession and incapacity that arose after the Kennedy assassination. Section 4 of the 25th Amendment specifically deals with the situation where a president is unable to discharge the powers and duties of his office, but has not voluntarily stepped aside. Here is how Section 4 works. The Vice President and a majority of the Cabinet can send a written declaration to Congress stating that the President is unable to discharge his duties. If they do that, the Vice President immediately assumes the powers of the office as acting President. The President can then contest this by sending his own declaration saying he is perfectly able to serve. But if the Vice President and Cabinet majority persist in their declaration, Congress has 21 days to resolve the dispute by a 2/3 vote of both chambers. 2/3 of the House and 2/3 of the Senate, both chambers, that threshold. If Congress does not reach that threshold, the President resumes the powers of the office. Now here is the key difference between the 25th Amendment and Article 2, Section 4 that most people do not understand. Impeachment is about misconduct, high crimes and misdemeanors, deliberate wrongdoing. The 25th Amendment is about incapacity, the inability to function in the role, physical illness, mental incapacity, situations where the President may not be acting wrongly intentionally, but simply cannot perform the duties of the office. When senators discuss invoking the 25th Amendment in connection with Trump's behavior, they are typically arguing that the behavior itself demonstrates some form of incapacity to govern within constitutional limits rather than deliberate criminal misconduct. That distinction matters legally and constitutionally, even though both conversations often happen at the same time. You have senators simultaneously discussing whether Trump has committed high crimes and misdemeanors serious enough to justify impeachment, and whether his behavior demonstrates an inability to discharge his duties responsibly enough to trigger the 25th. That dual conversation is genuinely extraordinary, and it tells you how seriously some members of the legislative branch are taking the current situation. Now let's talk about why the rhetoric around these clauses matters, even when the formal processes are not being triggered, because this is the part of the story that gets most lost when people focus on whether a removal actually happened tonight. The answer to that is no. The answer to that will almost certainly continue to be no in the near term, given the current congressional math. But the political significance of these conversations is real, and it operates through mechanisms that are different from the formal removal process. When a group of senators publicly invokes Article 2, Section 4, or calls for a 25th Amendment process, several things happen. The White House has to respond. Every response to the impeachment or removal talk puts the administration on the defensive and generates days of coverage about what specifically triggered the discussion. The senators who speak publicly about these mechanisms are drawing a very explicit line about what they consider to be beyond constitutional limits. And every Republican senator or member who stays silent or who explicitly defends Trump against these accusations is putting their own position on the record. The conversations create political and constitutional documentation of where people stand. And in a situation where the formal removal mechanisms may eventually become relevant, that documentation matters. Senators publicly discussing the constitutional mechanisms for removing a president in real time while that president is in office, that is not normal. It has not been normal in modern American political history, and the frequency with which it is happening is itself a story about how close the system feels to a breaking point, even when it has not actually broken yet. The Senate cannot invoke Article 2, Section 4 by itself. The dramatic headlines claiming it did are misleading in a specific and important way that you need to understand. Here is the reality. The Senate's role in the Article 2, Section 4 removal process is to conduct a trial after the House has already voted to impeach. The Senate cannot initiate that process on its own. It cannot decide to remove a president without the House first bringing charges by majority vote. And even after the House impeaches, the Senate needs 2/3 of its members to convict before removal happens. In the current Congress, Republicans control both chambers. The votes required for impeachment in the House and conviction in the Senate are not there, not even close to there, given the current political alignment of the Republican majority. So when headlines say the Senate invoked Article 2, Section 4 tonight, what is actually happening is that individual senators or groups of senators are publicly referencing the clause in speeches, letters, or statements. They are invoking it rhetorically, calling attention to it as the relevant constitutional standard, arguing that the president's conduct meets the threshold the clause describes. But invoking a constitutional clause in a speech is not the same thing as triggering the formal legal mechanism the clause describes. Words in a Senate chamber do not substitute for votes that actually meet the constitutional requirements. And the distinction matters because confusing the two, conflating a senator talking about Article 2, Section 4 with the Senate actually using it to remove the president creates a false picture of where the political and constitutional situation actually stands. The 25th Amendment is a separate tool for a different situation, and understanding the difference matters for understanding what is actually being discussed when lawmakers invoke both mechanisms at the same time. Article 2, Section 4 is about misconduct. The president did something wrong, something that rises to the level of high crimes and misdemeanors. The process is adversarial, prosecutorial, designed to punish wrongdoing and remove the person responsible. The 25th Amendment, Section 4, is about incapacity. The president is unable to discharge the duties of the office. Maybe because of physical illness, maybe because of mental incapacity, maybe because of behavior that demonstrates an inability to function within the constitutional requirements of the role. The 25th Amendment process requires the Vice President and a majority of the cabinet to initiate it, not the Senate, not the House. The executive branch itself has to conclude that the president cannot function. And in Trump's case, the Vice President is J.D. Vance, and the cabinet was appointed by Trump. The probability of that specific group of people initiating a 25th Amendment process against the president they serve is essentially non-existent in the current political reality. J.D. Vance leading a cabinet majority to declare Trump unable to discharge his duties would be one of the most extraordinary political events in American history. It is not happening in the current alignment of people and incentives. But the fact that senators are publicly raising it anyway tells you something about how certain members of the legislative branch are thinking about the situation they are watching. They are saying, even if we cannot force it, the constitutional tool exists, and the conversation about whether it should be used needs to be on the table. The rhetoric around Article 2, Section 4 and the 25th Amendment matters even when the formal mechanisms are not being triggered. In any normal political environment, these constitutional removal clauses are rarely discussed in connection with a sitting president. They are the nuclear option of American constitutional law. The framers designed them to be extremely difficult to use precisely because they wanted them held in reserve for only the most extreme situations. And right now, the most extreme constitutional tools in American political life are being discussed in mainstream political conversation regularly by serious people in connection with specific conduct by the current president. When senators publicly reference Article 2, Section 4 in the context of Trump defying court orders, that is those senators drawing a line and saying, this conduct is in the territory these clauses were written to address. When other senators or legal scholars raise the 25th Amendment after an inflammatory social media post threatening to bomb civilian infrastructure, that is serious people saying publicly that the behavior they are observing is beyond normal presidential conduct in a way that raises constitutional incapacity concerns. None of that rhetoric removes Trump from office tonight, but it does something that matters politically. It establishes a public record. It puts every senator who responds or who does not respond on on record, and it keeps raising the temperature and the stakes of every subsequent confrontation between the White House and the constitutional limits of executive power. The conversations are the story because conversations at this level about these specific clauses in connection with the sitting president's specific conduct are not background noise. They are the signal that the system is under stress in ways that have not been seen in modern American political history. And understanding that signal clearly without either dismissing it as just rhetoric or overstating it as imminent removal is what lets you actually make sense of what is happening in Washington right now. The constitutional tools, impeachment and the 25th Amendment, exist, but the political conditions to use them are not present. Republicans hold the majority, loyalty structures remain intact, and the gap between available mechanisms and actual political will is what makes this moment so unprecedented and tense. The discussions are real, but the formal removal process remains just out of reach.